Welcome to the Leadership School podcast. I'm your host, leadership and self-care coach, Kyla Cofer. Here at the Leadership School, you'll hear leaders from around the world sharing their stories and expertise on how to lead with balance and integrity. Our goal? Teach you how to be an extraordinary leader. Hey everybody, welcome back to Leadership School. As promised, I am here for part 2 of a conversation with my friend Jesan Sorrells. And this time we're getting into conflict resolution. If you haven't listened to part 1, go ahead and take a listen a few episodes back. But right now we're getting into the how, the why, the what of conflict resolution. And we're getting into some theories, what the term, the phrase actually means, and some practicalities of who you are in a conflict, what kind of roles you take on in a conflict, and then how that can help you lead towards resolutions. Hey, Son, just thanks again for coming here. This is a part 2. We're part 2 in our conversation, which I'm really excited about because all of my guests, we talk and it's like this awesome hour-long conversation. And then I think, wow, but there's just so much more. And so we're getting to do that. And this will probably be the second of many, and I'm really excited about it. So thanks for coming back to Leadership School. Welcome back.
Thank you for having me back on Leadership School. I am pleased to be here, and I'm very happy today to find out that we're going to be talking about one of the more difficult topics in leadership, how to navigate conflict.
Me too. So we were just talking a second ago and about how I'm not realizing I'm doing this conflict resolution series because a lot of my guests are going to be, we're talking about that. And some of the shorter episodes too, I'm talking about it because it comes up. And how many books have just as many books have been written about conflict as they have been about leadership, I think, or maybe not as many, but there should be as many because it's a hard conversation. It's a hard thing and it comes up and you actually have written a book on it. And I think I've got it somewhere up here on my shelf. So maybe you can do like a intro to what is conflict resolution. Tell us a little bit about your book and we'll kind of just have the conversation. We'll see how it goes from there.
Yeah, we'll just let the conversation flow. Yeah. That's what we'll do. It'll be like a fly on the wall experience for folks. So my background in conflict resolution and in conflict management, mediation, negotiation came out of my graduate school experiences at Abilene Christian University in Abilene, Texas. So I have a master's degree in conflict resolution and reconciliation with a focus on divorce and family mediation. Fundamentally, what that means is I used to sit down between two people who used to love each other and now don't and help them divide up the assets. One of the things that I want your listeners to understand is that conflict gets you into everything. Conflict is fundamental to how we exist as human beings. We use different words for conflict. Sometimes we'll call it a dispute. We'll call it a disagreement. We'll call it a difference of opinion. Fundamentally, though, what we are describing with that language are conflicts. We're describing the emotional, the psychological, even the physiological, because conflict does live in the body as well. There's many different conflict practitioners who point this aspect out. There's actually one woman, I can't think of her name now, it'll come to me as I'm talking, who actually navigates group conflict through dance. Actually had her on my podcast back in the day, the first podcast before I had this one, the most current one that I have right now. Anyway, so conflict lives everywhere, right?
It does.
Yeah.
And I used to do that too, actually. I used to work as, I was a legal assistant for a mediator, a divorce mediator. And so I would type up all the paperwork and do the back and forth. And in that situation, like these kinds that we're talking about, the conflict is known and it's out there and you're just trying to resolve it, right?
That's right.
So there are different levels then to the conflict resolution.
That's right. There are different levels to the conflict resolution. And I have to talk about how in any kind of conversation, we have to talk about not only the interpersonal nature of conflict, but also the interdisciplinary nature of thinking about conflict. So you talked about working in a law office. There are many different disciplines that influence how we think about conflict and how I think about conflict. Just a few of them include theology, psychology, physiology, biology, sociology. All of these in the law, all of these disciplines influence how we think about conflict, but also they influence how we resolve or manage or don't resolve and don't manage conflict, right?
Sure. Yeah.
So when you think about conflict between two people who used to be married and now don't love each other, those conflicts exist not only at a family level, but they also exist at levels, and I'm going to use a psychological term here, they exist at levels up and down in a hierarchy. And it's a hierarchy of story. And so the story that we tell ourselves about the conflict matters a heck of a lot more to us than the story that other people are telling us, even the other people involved in the conflict, about the conflict. And this is what makes resolving conflicts, this is one of the many factors that makes resolving conflicts so hard. Look, our stories create beliefs. Our beliefs create mental models, and then our mental models influence our behaviors. I'm not the first person to say this.
That's cognitive behavioral therapy right there.
Exactly.
Thoughts and beliefs lead to our actions. I teach this all the time in my workshops.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And our narratives are extremely powerful. Our stories matter. Okay. And so when you think about how you're going to navigate a conflict or how you're going to resolve a conflict, you have to think about your story. And then the part that's really hard is you have to get into the other party's story. And fundamentally, that's when negotiation really happens. That's getting into the other party's story at one level. That's where mediation comes in, which is bringing in another individual to help you get into that party's story. And then, of course, we have arbitration, which is our third level of resolving or managing conflicts. And arbitration is appeal to the highest level in the hierarchy, which is sometimes policy or an organizational process or an organizational structure. Then on top of that, you have the law, or you have society, or you have culture at a much broader scale. So this was a very long answer to a very short question, because inside of that question are multiple different ideals. Yeah. And so when you open it up, it's kind of like, just like when you open up a conflict, it kind of feels like a box of snakes. This is why conflict feels like a box of snakes to people, and they will do anything at all to avoid it. And we could talk about the styles of conflict that people have. There are 5 different styles that people approach conflict with and manage conflict with. We can also talk a little bit about the problems of manipulation versus persuasion in conflict, which there are problems. Which we talked about last time, which there are problems there. But I want to go back and answer the core question in a core way. So your core question was, what exactly is conflict resolution? Conflict resolution is the ability of two people to resolve a conflict between the two of them. I'm going to keep it as simple as possible.
You're doing that dictionary thing of where you're using the word in the definition.
Using the word in the definition. That's right. Whereas conflict management is the ability of two people to ride the conflict out without allowing it to escalate to places where they can be psychologically, emotionally, or even physiologically damaged, or minimizing that damage. I will tell you right now up front, I'm much more of a partisan for conflict management, because I don't believe that many conflicts can be resolved. I believe that most conflicts continue in our lives. They just tend to submarine, and then they pop up later on.
Yeah. So, I mean, gosh, it's funny. I was like, we're going to have this conversation about conflict resolution. And I know that this is a really big topic, but now I'm even hearing like, it's going to be like a pebble in the ocean that we're going to talk about right now. Like, I mean, there are a lot of different parts to it. And there are lots of different types of conflicts. I mean, we've mentioned like in a marriage, but you've got conflicts with your neighbors, you've got conflicts with your coworkers, you've got conflicts. One of my episodes recently was about the parking lot lady who I had a conflict with, who yelled at me in the parking lot for, not closing my door right. So there's different types of conflicts that are going to come up, and there's going to be different ways to manage or resolve all those conflicts. So when we say conflict resolution and conflict management, okay, so you're distinguishing, I'm hearing this distinguishment between two different things, but I'm not sure which one to ask about first. I want to know what like conflict management looks like, but really when you say conflict resolution, I want to know what it means to resolve a conflict. Like, does that mean the conflict's over and disappeared? Like my parking lot lady, that conflict's resolved because we've left the parking lot. She's gone. I'm never going to see this lady again. So to me, that conflict is resolved. And your look on your face is telling me, oh, but is it really?
Well, except you're still talking about it today. So this is the challenge of that word resolution.
Right. But I'm talking about it in terms of having a story and being able to have something to reflect on. But
Sure.
Yeah, you're right. So like, what does it really mean to have something resolved? Does it
end? Is it over? When you're doing a divorce, the paperwork's signed, but you still have to go and actually hand over the dresser and the art and separate the things and do that work. And then even when it's gone, you still have that memory and that story of having your life with that person. So,
and if you have children,
yes,
you still have to share those relationships with those children, with that other party with whom you have broken fundamental foundational relationship. This is why divorce hits people so hard. Look, the statistics are clear now in the United States. Well over 50% of divorces are initiated by women now in the United States. Well over 50%. You can go look that up anywhere else, anywhere online, reputable, irreputable. You can go look that up. That statistic's pretty solid. We've reached that tipping point where women initiate divorce more often than men do. And I'm not knocking women. I'm just saying that we've reached that point, right? We've had a major psychosocial, sociological shift in the relationship between genders around divorce. The other dynamic that we also don't talk about, and I don't want to make this a divorce podcast episode because we're not going to talk about that specifically because that's not what this is. But the other dynamic that we often don't talk about is that for men in general in a divorce, the emotional damage to them is much greater than it is to women. And we have some clear psychological data on this. And that is as a result of the conflicts that occur inside of a marriage. It's also the result of many other things that occur before that marriage breaks up that go into the divorce. And then post-divorce outcomes for men and women fundamentally are different as well. And so those are things we don't talk about in our culture or become very controversial because of how we think about gender and gender norms, how we think about the history of gender, how we think about the history of marriage. All of those dynamics come together when you're talking about divorce. Okay. That makes divorce conflicts very much a domino effect kind of event in people's lives. And actually, the top three things that people don't want to have happen in their lives, it used to be bankruptcy, death. Those are the top two, right, and job loss. Now it's divorce, death, and bankruptcy. Okay. Yeah. Job loss has kind of fallen to number 4, right? Because you can get another job, but creating a new relationship with someone, particularly a new relationship with someone where you're bringing children into that dynamic, becomes very difficult. Okay. The difference between resolution and management, right? What does resolution actually mean? It's interesting because only Americans ask this question.
Really?
Oh,
I'm surprised by that. I don't know. I don't know.
Okay, I'll be broader. Individuals who come from a Western conception of the world ask this question.
That makes sense.
So Americans, Canadians, Western Europeans, the Japanese, the South Koreans, those who have either adopted those Western norms or come directly from those Western norms tend to focus resolutely on this issue of resolution. Whereas folks who come from more Eastern norms tend to focus on the management of a conflict because conflict is seen as a circular, cyclical piece of the world and of relationships and of just the nature of existence. Mm-hmm. Whereas here in the West, and yes, I am using the capital W term of the West, here in the West, we tend to think of our stories as having a beginning, a middle, and an end. And you know who's responsible for that? Shakespeare. Shakespeare brought us the beginning, middle, and end structure, the 3-act structure of our stories. And that's how we structure our stories around conflict. So we need the conflict in the parking lot to end. We need the door to be closed. Yeah. And by the way, it's not just you that needs that. It's the other party in the conflict that needs that too. It's both of us because of how we're structured. Whereas if that fender bender occurred in, let's say, a place with more Eastern norms, that fender bender, that door opening incident or door closing incident would be integrated more effectively into the cyclical nature of that individual's experience. And this is where you see the difference between reconciliation and how reconciliation is thought of in different cultures in comparison to how reconciliation is thought of in the West. And we struggle to get to reconciliation with each other because we want things to have a closed door. We want conflicts to end. We want them to be resolved. That's why we use this language.
So I'm glad you brought up reconciliation because conflict resolution doesn't always mean reconciliation, but it can include that. So, and we've mentioned divorce and all that too, but we are here at the leadership school. We're talking about leading in all types of situations, at work, at school, at your nonprofit, at your volunteer, in your family. So leadership happens in every part of life. It's not just something like it's the CEO who's the leader, it's in every part. So it is important that we're talking about all these different things, but reconciliation is a whole different game and a whole different level of resolving a conflict.
That's right.
So I would love to talk about that too, but I feel like that is going to be like another 17 episodes. So I feel like maybe we're doing a podcast spinoff here on conflict resolution and reconciliation. And it's like a whole class, and there are whole courses, and we're going to talk about this next season in leadership school about whole entire courses and degrees that you can take on peace studies, which is just remarkable to me. So did I skip this? Did you already explain conflict management? Did I skip ahead?
I did talk about management. So management is this more cyclical idea that we're going to kind of work through all of the varying emotional and psychological and sociological implications of the conflict. And we're going to realize that it's going to impact ourselves and our bodies and our story and our narrative. And by the way, here's the kicker piece for your listeners. We're going to be okay with that. We're not going to be anxious. We're not going to be stressed. We're not going to be angry, which is a second order emotion. We're not going to be frustrated. We're not going to have a conflict at work. You talked about work. We're not going to have a conflict at work with that bloodsucker of a boss of ours. And yes, I did use that term, and then go home and kick the dog. Like, we're not going to do that, right? Instead, what we are going to do is we're going to integrate the conflict into our lives. This is more of the management idea. What I tell folks is conflict is part of the process of change. You can have no great change, not one, without experiencing conflict.
There is a scene from a movie that I really love. I'm trying to think of the movie. I want to say it's got Kate Hudson, I believe. And they're like, her best friend died and left her responsible for her child. Well, her best friend's husband also left his best friend and responsible for it. And the two hated each other. And so then they were in charge of now raising this child together. I can't remember the name of the movie, but there's a scene.
I vaguely remember that romantic comedy.
Yeah. It is good. But there's a scene in it that I really loved. And it relates to what you're saying, because it just really stuck out to me, and clearly enough that I'm bringing it up. They get in this huge argument. They don't get married. They choose to live together to raise this child, right? But they're trying to make it work out when they don't like each other. They have like a dinner party over. So they have all their friends over in another room. Well, they go into the kitchen and they have this kick out, blow out argument where they're yelling and they're telling each other exactly what they think about the other person and all the problems that they have. And then the guy just starts storming out. And one of the house guests, as they're walking, turns and he goes, "If my wife and I argued like that, we'd still be married."
There you go.
And that always really fascinated and struck me, because I thought, wow, if we have the courage to be that vulnerable and honest with ourselves and with our partners and in our relationships, not necessarily having to be derogating the other person and like yelling at them, but to really be that vulnerable, how would that change our relationships and the way that we perceive conflict? For those of you that might be interested in the spiritual side of leadership, try checking out the podcast Psyche Magic. This is with psychotherapist Jordan Hale, and she's talking about how we can teach ourselves through our dreams. Jordan and her guests are offering some guided meditations, some reflections on what maybe the symbols in our dreams might mean for our waking life. I found it really helpful. You might too, so go check it out. You can find it at psychemagicpodcast.com, and it's available on any podcast platform.
This is the holy grail concept inside of all conflicts. And the challenge of becoming more vulnerable is the challenge of being, and I write about this in my third book, which is out right now, 12 Rules for Leaders. We have a whole chapter on conflict in that book, because that is one of the areas that leaders have to focus on is conflict. But inside of that idea is a deeper concept, which is that individuals must be clear on their motives and on what they want. And the reason we have blowout confrontations, which can then lead to blowout conflicts, and by the way, confrontation is not conflict. I'll leave that for you there. But the reason we have blowout engagements with other folks is because we haven't been clear on what we want, because we don't even know our own motives. We don't even know our own desires. So in a marriage, or in a work relationship, or in a neighbor relationship, or in the relationship, and I want to go back to the woman in the parking lot. You're not going to get vulnerable with the woman in the parking lot about your identity and about what the car means to you and about what the door means to you and about what she means to you and about how confronting her in this particular way brought up all of this trauma from XYZ plate. You're not going to do that. You just want it to be done. That's where the resolution idea comes from. I want her to shut up, quite frankly. I want her to stop talking and I want her to move on.
And I want it to be peaceful.
Right. And you want it to be peaceful.
There is actually, let's just pause there and then we can go back to that thought, because just quickly in this story, the woman pulled into a parking spot when I had my door open. She asked me to close the door and I said, wait a second, because I was trying to get my child into her car seat, and she proceeded to cuss me out and tell me how horrible I was because I didn't close my door. Well, she pulled out, turned around and parked immediately behind us and everything was fine. And as she was digging through her purse, I realized I live in Tennessee and we have an open carry state. Like, she could have a gun in her purse and I need to make sure that I'm resolving this conversation peacefully. I mean, there's actual literal safety thing that could come up. And so, I mean, it ended and she was fine. And I mean, she continued to cuss me out, but whatever, for not closing my door. And so when I'm saying resolve a conflict peacefully, I mean, sometimes that is an important thing to do.
Absolutely.
I have no idea. She could have been fine just having a bad day, but
she could have been. And how do we get vulnerable with a person in that situation? The reality is we're not, because we don't have a relationship with them. And this is the key part. This is one of the key parts that people forget about conflict. We don't have a relationship with that person. So anthropologists talk about levels of relationship. And what they mention is that there are 3 levels of relationship. So the first level of relationship is family and friends. These are people whom you should be able to have a blowout confrontation with, or a blowout argument with, or be able to have a calm interaction with, and be able to be very clear about what your motives are, what you want, what you don't want, why you want it, how you want it, when you want it. And the reality is, while you should be able to have those conversations and should be able to reduce conflict there and be more vulnerable, very often that's a place where a lot of hiding is occurring because the relationships are so tight and they are so meaningful and they are so deep. It doesn't help that, and if we're thinking about individuals who are maybe going back to school, maybe starting college, maybe going through college programs, maybe going through high school, or even their parents, if we're thinking about the familial context of that, the devices don't help. The messages of media don't help in that, right? The messages from friends and the images from media don't help in that. The media culture that we've built around our very powerful devices hasn't actually helped us become more vulnerable with each other. As a matter of fact, it's made our behavior and the dopaminergic rewards we get from that behavior. And dopaminergic just means our dopamine inhibitors go off in our brains and we feel really good. Well, all of that stuff has been reinforced through our media and through our devices. Again, I'm not the first person to say this. You can go find other folks who are saying this as well. This is not controversial. It's just reality. Look around your own house. Well, if we're all on the devices and none of us are conversating, then how are we getting vulnerable? And by the way, it was even hard when there were no devices.
Oh, yeah. Oh,
right. So you're very clear on that.
How many of us have relationships in our families from, we're millennials or whatever, and before devices existed. And we don't have good relationships with our families because it's so challenging and we have expectations, right? Whenever we're approaching a conflict or any type of relationship, we're always bringing our own expectations to it. But guess what? So is the other person. And we often hide a lot of things about ourselves because of our expectation of how we want that relationship to go and be perceived.
That's correct.
And how we want to be perceived.
That's right. That's about clarity of motive, clarity of need, clarity of desire, right? Okay. Then we go to a second level relationship. So the first level is family and friends. Second level is like our work relationships.
And acquaintances, like people
people we know, folks like that. I'm going to use COVID as a case study for what happens when second level collapses into first level. And I'm going to use COVID to say this. Regardless of what you may think about the global or national or state level response to COVID, the response to it triggered psychological conflicts at an interpersonal level. And it also triggered anxiety and stress because what happened fundamentally was that our second level relationships, which had always been held at a distance, now collapsed Think about maybe a boulder going down through a pyramid, broke all those layers down and collapsed everything down into family and friends. So it's not that I'm having a Zoom call or I'm having a Zoom meeting with a client that I would normally have at the office away from my first level relationships. That's not the issue. The issue is I'm having it and I'm also managing the first level relationships and the potential for first level conflicts and confrontations while I'm also managing all the second level stuff that's happening out here.
Yeah, it was just everything.
So I'm doing two things at once. Correct. And the Industrial Revolution, all 150 years of it in the West, basically told us we don't have to do that. It set up separation. And we've all been very comfortable with that at a behavioral level. We are incredibly uncomfortable with what is happening now, and we don't have the language to describe why we're uncomfortable. Well, here's the language. The second level relationships have all now collapsed into the first level. And this is why at work, people had work relationships that were very specific, water cooler relationships, work husband or work wife or work girlfriend or work boyfriend relationships that were separate in another sphere. And the conflicts that occurred in those relationships were so much more powerful. And partially that is because of the scale of the teams that you're in and the size of the teams that you're in. So if you're at work and you're in a team of 25 and that team shrinks to 10, you actually have more responsibility to manage those conflicts effectively, not less, because the ties that bind have gotten tighter.
Plus, at the same time, you have more work.
Correct. And you have more, and you have the work. That's right.
So conflicts can exist in all level of relationships, the relationships you have with your job and not just with another person, but
right.
having to do like a work when there's a problem at work.
That's right. Accomplish a goal that you may not particularly care about with people you wouldn't necessarily pick to be vulnerable with all the time.
Yeah, this is going to be hard.
It's not easy.
Especially, and if you don't have those skills to know, like, okay, what do I do when this is really bad, and you don't have the leadership. This is where those leaders come in. If you don't have the leadership that shows you how to manage it and that models how to deal with the extra challenges.
That's right.
Because a lot of leaders we don't know how to do this. So these are things that we're still learning in society.
That's right. Well, and leaders are managing their own stuff, right? So I have a chapter in my book around leadership and compassion fatigue, right? Mm-hmm. And I compare leaders to Pagliacci, the old Italian opera about the clown who cries, right? Many times leaders are expected to be the clown. They're expected to put on the show, put on the leadership show, and the followers of those leaders aren't particularly interested in seeing the clown cry. They don't want that level of vulnerability because that may trigger something in them that they are not prepared to deal with. And again, what you've done in that one situation or that one instance where the leader has become or has gone to that level of vulnerability is you've collapsed the levels. You've collapsed the levels, right? I want people to continue to think about it in those kinds of terms. How do you collapse those levels? Now, you can either do it accidentally, where situations like COVID sort of push you into this that are outside of your control, or you could do it intentionally. And intentional conflict management, intentional conflict engagement, intentional confrontation, having a fight on purpose in order to expose something is a tactical move that can be used and is often used by people to accomplish a larger strategic goal. And we could talk a little bit about that if we would like, but I really want to talk about the 5 different modes of managing conflict.
I was hoping we would get there. Yes. So
we'll get there.
we've gone through like different levels of conflict, different levels of relationship, conflict management, conflict resolution, and we're not going to flush all of that out here in this episode. This is something we'll continue to talk about for the next few years in leadership school, and you can take classes on, you can research, and there's tons of books, and you've mentioned yours. So if this is an area that you as a listener are wanting to grow in, there's plenty of resources out there, and Jesan and I are here to help you with that as well. But let's go ahead and touch on those 5 methods and modes. I'm not sure what word you use. Let's touch on those and kind of give you an introduction of what that looks like.
Sure. So when we think about how we manage conflict, we have to think about how we begin that process with ourselves. Physician, heal thyself. It always starts with us, and then it works outward in larger concentric circles out to everybody else, right? I can't change the world. I can only change myself. I really can't change the world.
Personal development of the leader matters. Just because you're in a leadership role, don't think you've got it figured out. You've got to continue to develop yourself. Yes.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So let's start off with that idea of who are we? Who am I? Not who are we? Who am I in a conflict, right? I may be an accommodator. An individual who is an accommodator is a person who really values goals and relationships. But here's the thing. They want the relationship more than the goal. So they're willing to preserve the relationship at the expense of accomplishing the goal. Now, very often in accommodators, this can create resentment. This can sometimes be seen as a self-sacrifice or a martyring mode of approaching a confrontation or approaching a conflict.
I'm hearing another phrase being used as people pleaser.
I have heard that term used by individuals who identify themselves as accommodators. Yes. And look, there's a dark side. There's a dark side to all of these types, right? There's a positive side and there's a dark side, right? Sometimes you do need to accommodate other people. Sometimes you do need to people please them.
And the truth is we need all of those things. We need all of these different types of personalities and approaches. No one way is going to be right because we're all here because we all need each other and we all need these different perspectives and approaches. So continue.
That's right. And all of these perspectives and approaches, by the way, exist inside of all of us at the same time. It's just the degree to which we use them varies based on things like personality, the big 5 factors of psychology, which I'm not going to talk about here. That's way too big a topic to talk about, but you can Google the big 5 factors and look more into that. Those things, all come together inside of these management styles. Okay, so you've got accommodating, right? Then you have the style that's more focused on collaboration. Collaborators want to have their goals and they want to have their relationship. They want to have their cake and they want to eat it too. This is considered to be the holy grail, right, of conflict management styles. But here's the dark side of collaboration. Collaborators believe that time is endless. So there's no such thing as a resolved conflict in the Western context. It's more like this is just going to go on and we can just keep on having these conversations that go in circles and we can just continue not accomplishing the goal and it's okay. And everything will work out just fine. By the way, this drives other conflict management styles crazy. People with other conflict management styles crazy, particularly the next one I'm about to talk about. And so that collaborative mode, while very good for building teams and for building relationships and for making conflicts and confrontations more manageable in the short term, in the long term can be damaging and deleterious because, again, in a Western context, nothing ever ends. The door never closes, right? Mm-hmm. So we're constantly revisiting something from maybe 5 years ago, 6 years ago, 7 years ago, or five months ago, 6 months ago, 7 months ago, and we're never actually closing the door. And that could frustrate people who are in those other styles.
How many of us have brought up a past like harm in an argument?
That's right.
I remember that one time you did this.
That's right. Exactly. So we have accommodators and we have collaborators. Then we have competitors and controllers. Competitors and controllers are individuals who, in general, in conflict, don't really care about another person's feelings. They just care about accomplishing the goal. They want to get to the goal. These individuals tend to be perceived as leaders in either workplaces or homes. But because they don't care about relationships, they walk over a lot of people all the way up to the top of the mountain. And when they fall off the top of the mountain, which they invariably do, they meet every single person they stepped on all the way up the mountain, and each one of those people kicks them on the way down. But they're okay with that because they never valued those relationships in the first place. And this is the thing that people who are not computer controllers, for whom that style of managing conflict is not dominant, they have to understand the psychology of a computer controller. A computer controller actually doesn't care if you cry in a conflict or not. It doesn't really matter to them. Are we going to get this thing done or not? Are you in or out? You're talking about movies.
Because they're so goal focused. They're
so goal focused. That's right. And in general, these folks tend to come off as being narcissistic or even sometimes being sociopathic, right? They are perceived as being that, even though they are not, right? They may not necessarily be so. It's just in that conflict management moment, they are seeking to get the best outcome immediately, regardless of anybody else's feelings.
And sometimes that's very, very valuable, like in a disaster situation.
Correct.
Or an emergency situation. You've got to get to that goal. Like you have to get that person to the hospital. You've got to get this situation resolved in a way like that you're moving along. So that's extremely helpful to have people in those situations who are skilled at that.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. If my house is burning down, I really don't want an accommodator or a collaborator to show up. I really want a computer controller type to show up because I don't really care about the firefighter's feelings. I care about my house burning down.
Right. Yep.
From there, we go into the mode of conflict management that is very often crapped on, and yes, I did use that term again, the most, and it's very much in the West ignored because we really like the competing controlling because it feels powerful and like a leader and like we're managing things. Mm-hmm. But this one is very valuable because people do it all the time, but they don't like to talk about it. And this is the avoider mode. People avoid conflicts when they do not care about the goal and they don't care about the relationship. And that's an interesting intersection right there. I don't care about the goal and I don't care about the relationship.
That's interesting that you call that out because I can see a lot of times when I have been, or you see people avoiding a conflict and running away from it and not trying to work on it, manage it, resolve it, whatever. And I think that we don't realize in that moment that that's what we're doing. And that's what we're saying is that if I'm going to avoid this, it's because I don't care about you and I don't care about how this is going to turn out. So it's really important to be able to acknowledge that. And I think that's when kind of, boundaries plays a part in all of this and everything I always talk about. But realizing that when you're saying no to something, you're saying yes to something else. When you're saying yes to something, you're saying no to something else. So if I'm saying yes to avoiding this conflict, I'm saying no to being in a relationship with you.
That's right.
And it's important to admit that and know that. And if you are ignoring that, you're hurting yourself and you're hurting other people.
You're also moving in the space. And here's what I tell people who admit to being genuine avoiders. Very few people will publicly admit to this, but occasionally you will find, and in the now close to, 15 years I've been doing this work in conflict, I've only come across a couple of people in workplace situations that have openly admitted to being avoiders. Only two. Most people don't want to admit to that. Yeah. They'll say, sure, I'll avoid a conflict when it doesn't matter to me. That's a goal. Or sure, I'll avoid a conflict when I don't care about the other person. That's the relationship part. Yeah. But they won't go full bore into the whole, I absolutely don't care.
Well, I also wonder too, if sometimes it's us that we're not valuing in that moment. When we're avoiding something, yeah. It's not, I might care about my husband and I might avoid the conflict, but it might be the relationship with myself that I'm avoiding in that moment and not valuing. Not that Absolutely. I don't care about who I am, but there are times when we don't realize that we're not placing value on ourselves. Hey, thanks so much for listening. Since you've listened this far, it tells me you're really enjoying the content. And I'm so, so grateful. I work really hard to bring you some awesome resources to help really enhance your leadership game. If you're liking this, can you pause really quickly? Make sure you're subscribed, but then also share with one person or more people who you think could really benefit from the content. My goal is to really bring this into some of the top podcasts on leadership in the world, and you can help get there and help us grow by sharing this with everyone you know. Thank you so much. I'm glad you're enjoying the episode.
That's right. And so it's interesting to watch individuals pick avoidance or choose avoidance as a strategy, which is what you're talking about. And I think how most people pursue it, or not strategy, I'm sorry, as a tactic versus avoidance as an overall doctrinal strategy, right? As part of an overall way of living, right? You do occasionally run across those people. I think of an incident where I was working with a group of folks in a workplace that was a state government run workplace. I'll just use it. I'll frame it as that. I won't tell what state. It doesn't matter. It's just a state government run workplace. And it was about 100 people in the room. We had them take a conflict management style survey, which all of this information that I'm talking about comes from a conflict management style survey. And you can go find it online. Just Google conflict management style survey and all that information is right there. And this individual came up as a strong avoider. And I went over to him and I asked him, I've never seen somebody come up with, it's been very rare, seeing someone come up as a pure avoider on this survey. And I said, how are you engaging with this? How is this working out for you? And he's like, it's working out just fine for me. I'm in the IT department downstairs. People send me stuff and I just ignore it. And then I go home. It's fine.
Oh, well, it works when it works for you.
Everybody in the room laughed, but he was dead serious. He was deadly serious. And I thought, and the question I always ask avoiders who are adopting this posture towards conflict or even towards confrontation as a mode of doctrinal strategy for a life, I ask this question all the time. And if you're an avoider out there, I would ask you this question. Are you happy with the outcomes that you're getting? Are you actually fulfilled with those? Because if you're even just 1% unfulfilled, you probably need to change something. And I'll just leave that at that.
Also, I think from a coaching standpoint, though, too, when you're avoiding something, it's also a method of protecting yourself. Mm-hmm. When we have learned to do that as adults, usually it was because we were trying to survive something when we were younger, that we were trying to survive some sort of
trauma, some sort of fear. And by avoiding that, it's really a method of protection and of self preservation. And that's okay. It's also, though, important to know, to realize that that's what's going on. Because if we're still trying to protect ourselves from things that might not exist anymore, we have to, this is a way to acknowledge that and understand ourselves a little bit more, to go, okay, what am I trying to protect myself from? What is my fear trying to protect myself from? Why am I avoiding that? And that can just give us a good insight into who we are and how we're approaching situations.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And then the final conflict management type. So we've gone through accommodating, collaborating, competing, controlling, and avoiding. The final conflict management type is compromising. Compromisers believe in win-win solutions. They tend to employ all four of the conflict management styles at once. So I've watched folks do this in real time, and they will go from a collaborative style to an accommodating style to an avoiding style to a competing, controlling style. And you can watch their styles shift in real time. And when you pull them aside and you talk to them later, they will tell you that they see all sides of the conflict at once. They see all sides of the goal at once. They see all the relationships at once. And they see all of the, and by see, I just mean psychologically see, and sometimes even physically see, they see the ways they can move the team, the other party, the conflict towards a particular negotiated end. These individuals are dynamic. These individuals, and they're not rare. You can find them in fields such as hostage negotiation for your local police department. You could find them in law firms, okay, where folks are dealing with really complicated legal questions and where they're trying to manage people's emotions as well as the complicated legal question, okay, and those outcomes. You can also find them in engineering firms where they're managing complicated projects with a lot of money at stake and a lot of time and a lot of personalities. These are individuals who bring everything together in persuasion. Remember, I was going to talk about persuasion. These are individuals who understand the value of persuasion at a very deep level, and they walk the line between persuasion and manipulation, and other parties can't tell which side of the line they're falling on, but they know which side of the line they're falling on. They are hyper intentional. They're hyper aware. And they're dialed in and they're living inside of the conflict in the moment with that negotiated or that compromising style. Compromising often gets a bad rap because we really like our leaders to be computer controllers. We like our leaders to be bullheaded, stubborn, going to go drive and get the thing done, right? But the reality is on your team, you need all of those styles together. And you really need, if you're a computer controller, you really need a number two that's either a compromiser or a collaborator to kind of soften out the things that you're doing on the back end, right? To kind of soften out the approaches that you're taking and to get you to better goals.
Because we're all relational. We are
Correct.
emotionally
That's
driven,
right.
and we're going to talk about emotions in a future episode. So stay tuned, people. But we are emotional and relational people, and so we exist on that level. We don't exist. I always say this on my episodes. We don't exist in a vacuum. We do not. This is not a black hole. This is interactions. It's back and forth. And really, in trying to approach conflicts, it's realizing that this is a relationship in some fashion. Even, the relationship I had with the parking lot lady, whatever
That's right.
that type of relationship is, it's relationship just is an interaction that we have with other humans. And this is how we live our lives. This is how we're made to exist here on this planet. So these are important things to know about ourselves. So got your conflict style. And so taking that, how do you approach a conflict? I'm going to just, for sake of time and for sake of simplicity, divide us into two different types of conflicts. We've got the conflict that's like the conflict that is kind of maybe a work conflict, something that's approaching like maybe bigger. We know it. When you're doing a divorce mediation, the conflict's there. You're kind of at that point. But then you have the conflict that's an immediate argument. Someone's comes up to you and they say something and immediately your senses go off and you're in an argument and you didn't know it. So you've got like these two different spaces of conflict happening. So maybe we can just offer some really quick tips for what do you do? What do you do in this moment when all of a sudden you realize you're in a conflict or you've seen this kind of going on for some time?
Right. If you are in a conflict that just sort of pops up outside of your awareness, right? A short-term conflagration, a fire. This is the thing I want you to kind of have image I want you to have in your head. Most people are reactive rather than responsive in that moment. And by the way, the reaction is I want to put the fire out and stop the fire from burning, which is legitimate, by the way. That's 250,000 years of human brain evolution that's coming to bear in that moment. Fight, flight, fear, freeze response, right? Absolutely coming to bear. Yes. And we could talk about resources. Malcolm Gladwell talks about this tip in his great book, Blink, very simply and very beautifully. But Kenneth Cloak, who is a master of writing about conflict management and resolution and actual practical tips and practices, and is the grandfather in many ways of many of the things that I've been saying today. And you can go find his books anywhere. Great resource to go look up. So Kenneth Cloak, or if you don't want to go that deep, Malcolm Gladwell in his book, Blink. What you want to do is you want to shortcut your reactive impulses. This is incredibly difficult. When the conflagration comes up, you have to, and this is really comes through training, but you have to, number one, calm yourself physiologically. Because the first thing that's going to happen is your pupils are going to dilate, your breath's going to quicken, the hairs on your arms are going to stand up. You're going to be ready to fight, or you're going to be ready to flee, or you're going to freeze and your brain's going to go blank. So anytime you can short circuit that panic mode moment in a conflict, in a short term, this is just popping up kind of thing. My first big tip is figure out ways to get yourself not necessarily more inside of those conflicts, but figure out a way to get yourself more in the mode of a panic mode so you can control that thing. Meditation is helpful with this. Certain forms of martial arts are helpful with this, particularly combat-based martial arts, where you are forced to engage with panic immediately. Certain forms of activities in the game space are actually very helpful for this. So there's different ways you could train your mind to respond rather than to react. Once you're in that space, though, of response rather than reaction, and I'll just tell you what I do. When I'm in that space of response rather than reaction, the first thing I do is stop, literally stop. Then I think. I actually turn my rational part of my brain on. What I do is I tell the gibbering hamster, shut up. The world's not burning down. You need to be quiet. I discipline the amygdala, right? So stop, think with my neocortex. Listen. I actually don't talk. I shut up as I'm trying to hear what the other person's actually saying and listen past my own emotional moment. So stop, think, listen, and then speak. By the way, this happens in about 10 milliseconds. So it's got to be a lot of practice in doing this.
Well, I'm really glad that you said the training. I remember the very first time I heard about nonviolence and peacemaking. Well, might not be the first time, but I was starting to learn about this as an adult. I just didn't grow up with this idea. I was asking a person, I said, well, what are you going to do in a situation like that? And he said, well, if a situation comes up where it's a violent interaction with somebody, I have rehearsed in my mind and I have practiced and worked through myself and trained myself to a way that it will be an easy response. And my goal is that no one will get hurt. And I was just so impressed by that we can actually practice these things in our mind and take your mind through potential types of situations and types of different conflicts and how you'll respond. And the more you do that, you are preparing your mind. Your mind will automatically go to those places that you want it to go because you've taught it how to do that. So it's not like we're going to learn how to resolve conflict the day it comes up. This is not something that we should do. No. It's not like anything in life. We have to slowly train ourselves and practice those things. So I'm really glad that you brought up the training and to train our minds to do that, to stop, think, and then listen. That's really important.
Yep. Stop, think, listen, and communicate. STLC, if you want a quick acronym on that. Now, for longer term conflicts, for confrontations, for disputes, for disagreements that have been going on for a longer period of time, it doesn't really matter if you're at home, and this is happening in your family, or if this is happening in the workplace or in your neighborhood. If you're aware of the players, aware of the relationships, aware of the emotional dynamics, your responsibility is to plan. That's the key word there. Your responsibility is to thoughtfully and intentionally plan. I literally want you to sit down and write down what you're going to say and what you're going to do.
Wow.
Case in point. I had a conflict with the HOA in the neighborhood that I live in. And through a whole series of unfortunate events, they ended up sending me a legal cease and desist letter. Now, for most people who aren't trained the way that I am, they would get a cease and desist letter, and the first thing they do is panic. Their amygdala goes off, and they yell and scream, and it's a whole bunch of different things happen after that. I literally laughed like that, and I told my wife, I'll fix this problem. Don't worry. I looked at the letter, and it said that I had 15 days to respond. I made a plan to take all 15 days to respond. I am not going to hurry. I'm not going to react. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my 15 days that you have given me. I'm going to go and I'm going to research your own rules. I'm going to research your own processes and procedures. I'm going to research this law firm. I'm going to write my own letter. I'm going to go get my own lawyer to certify this letter. And on the 15th day, at the very possible last moment, I'm going to send my response to you. That's planning. Yeah. Get rational in a long-term conflict. Get hyper-rational. Make a plan. Look, the individuals who make a plan wind up in a better spot tactically and strategically than individuals who just react.
And hope and wait.
Hope and wait. Right. And I often tell people hope is not a strategy. It might be a place in Arkansas that Bill Clinton was from, the former president of the United States, but it is not a strategy. Don't hope. Plan. Otherwise, you will fail. So, as a result of making that plan, I'll just close the story. As a result of making that plan, my HOA saw that I was serious, just as serious as they were, and we moved into a different negotiation space because we all knew what the rules of the game are. And I've always said this, by the way, if you're negotiating, you have to know what the rules of the game are with the other party. And if the other party is setting the rules, then you have to come to the table with some rules of your own. And now we can begin to negotiate. But the only way you can do that is if you plan.
And if you've done your research and your information, this even works. I'm thinking back to when I negotiated a major salary raise once. I remember my boss saying, "You're the highest paid legal secretary in the state." And I thought, well, I'm the only one who works for you. And if you wanted to, I'd done my research. I said, if you want to pay me less, then you have to hire more people to do all the jobs that I'm doing. Because I had done all this research and I knew what my job was worth. I knew I knew I deserved to be paid in all the work that I was doing, and I was able to get the salary that I wanted. And I got everything that I asked for because I had researched and I had looked into it and had planned, and I was ready for every single argument that came up. And it wasn't me just, oh, hey, can I get a raise? And just hoping for that. It was being prepared and knowing for that and having that information available. When you I love that you said know the rules of the game, but when you have information, when you have education, you have data, it's so much easier to show up with confidence. You are not going to convince your elderly grandmother to vote for your political party by just trying to win her over. No, you probably won't convince her anyways, but if she asks you a question about something, you better be ready to know your research and you better be there with statistics and data and to say, well, this is the reason why, Grandma.
That's right.
Any type of conflict, it's helpful.
Well, and so many people get all wrapped up in their own emotions, their own emotional content about whatever the content of the conflict is. So you mentioned trying to switch Grandma's voting pattern, right? Well, I have emotional content about my grandma's voting pattern, even though it's not my voting pattern, even though it has nothing to do with me at all. I have emotional content about that thing that she's doing. And I haven't worked through any of that. Instead, I just laid it off on the avatar of Grandma in my head and said, Grandma needs to change. Remember, I started back here with the tips and started back there with the conflict management styles. Physician, heal thyself. It begins with you. Yeah. All good conflict management. And if you want to go to resolution, if you want to close the story, okay. All good conflict resolution begins with you.
Oh, wow. Absolutely. That's awesome. I think that is a great place to end this conversation. I think it's just the tip of the iceberg. We're the very beginning of this story of learning what it looks like to really resolve some conflicts. But we've talked about lots of different approaches, some different theory and different ideas here. So tell us again the name of your book, because where is it? I know it's up here somewhere. I've got too many up here. I've got it somewhere. So, yes, it's okay. You've got several of them, but your conflict one.
I've got several of them. Yes. So thank you once again for having me on the Leadership School. I really do appreciate this. It's been a great opportunity, and I feel blessed that you have brought me back a second time to talk about a topic which clearly I'm passionate about, and it is this topic of conflict. If you want to find out more about managing conflict. Yes, I have written a book, but not necessarily on conflict. So the first book that I ever wrote was called Marketing for Peace Builders, How to Market Your Value to a World in Conflict. That's more oriented towards if you want to build a business around the process of helping people manage conflicts and resolve them potentially. Now, that book was written many years ago. Much of the marketing information in there has changed because the marketing world has shifted. I probably need to do a second or third edition of that book, actually, by this point. I've been thinking about that and then backburnering it. But you can go pick that up. It does have some genuine baseline things in there that can help you think about how to take all of this complicated information and put it into a marketing bucket so you can actually get the word out there and change the world. My second book, which is really focused on the workplace, is entitled My Boss Doesn't Care. 100 Essays on Disrupting Your Workplace by Disrupting Your Boss. And yes, I did say disrupting your boss. Occasionally, you will run across a workplace that's so bureaucratic, so resistant to change, and you can see the problems that are in the workplace and you don't feel as though you have the power to change them. This is the book for you because it starts again with you. It challenges you in its various essays to really begin to think differently about your level of assertiveness, to think differently about the workplace you're in, to think differently about the changes you want to make. It all starts with you. And my most recent book, the third book, which I believe is the book that Kyla is referring to, 12 Rules for Leaders, the Foundation of Intentional Leadership, with contributions from my co-writer, Bradley Madigan, is out right now on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and through like 70 other distributive outlets. You could just Google it and it's all over the place. And in this book, we talk about the 12 areas that every leader needs to know about. And two of our rules are focused on areas we've talked about today, dealing with difficult teams and individuals, and of course, conflict management. So go check that out and go pick that up. And if you want to listen to my podcast, it's the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books, where we read a great book and we talk about what leaders can learn from that book, from that great piece of literature, because very often reading and trying to understand literature is better as a leader for you than reading and trying to understand yet another book on conflict resolution.
Yet another. Well, there's so many because they're so valuable and helpful, and each one will help us grow just a little bit more. So,
That's right.
So many resources available. Jesan, thank you so much for being such an amazing guest and for coming on a second time. We are just beginning our conversation about conflict resolution, conflict management, and what that looks like, and training our minds and training ourselves so that we can show up as better leaders. I'm really grateful for you and for your time. Thanks so much.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Hey, thank you so much for listening. If you've liked what you heard and you want some more tools and resources to help you on your journey, go check out kylacofer.com/free stuff.